Dean Martin's hand had been shaking for the last 20 minutes, not from the bourbon he was pretending to drink, not from the poker game he'd stopped playing, but because Elvis Presley was about to walk through that door, and Dean knew exactly what he deserved. Wait, because what Dean didn't know as he sat there trying to keep his famous smile from cracking was that Elvis wasn't coming to fight him, and the photograph Elvis carried in his jacket pocket would shatter every wall Dean had built around himself for 50 years, and nobody in that room would ever forget what happened next. The Sands Hotel, August 14th, 1965, 11:47 at night. Dean sat at the center table in the private poker room on the 32nd floor, surrounded by the only people in the world he trusted. Frank Sinatra to his left, nursing a Jack Daniels and pretending to read his cards. Sammy Davis Jr. across the table, chain-smoking parliaments and watching the door like a man expecting trouble. Peter Lawford 2 seats down, looking pale. Joey Bishop dealing cards nobody was playing. The room smelled like Cuban cigars, and expensive cologne, and something Dean couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. Or both wrapped together so tightly you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Dean's bourbon sat untouched, amber liquid catching the chandelier light. He'd poured it 20 minutes ago. His throat was too tight. His stomach churned like it hadn't since he was a kid in Steubenville dive bars. Frank cleared his throat. "He's not coming, Dino." Dean didn't look at him, kept his eyes on the door. "He's coming." "Maybe he forgot about it," Sammy offered. His voice was hopeful, too hopeful. "Maybe he's got better things to do than he's coming," Dean repeated. Because Dean knew. The same way you know when you've crossed a line you can't uncross. The same way you know when you've said something that can't be unsaid. The same way you know when a man has decided he's done letting you get away with it. 3 months ago on The Tonight Show, Dean had been drinking harder than usual. Johnny asked about Elvis, and Dean smiled that famous smile and said the words that haunted him since Elvis. Flash in the pan. 5 years he'll sell used cars in Memphis. Rock and roll's destroying American music. A disgrace. That boy's gonna die alone because nobody with real talent will ever respect him. The audience had laughed. Johnny had laughed. Dean had gone home that night and thrown up in his bathroom for 20 minutes. Notice something here, because what Dean told himself that night was that he was just doing his job, just being the Dean Martin everyone expected. But what kept him awake until dawn was the look in his own eyes when he'd caught his reflection in the studio monitor. The look of a man who'd just thrown a punch at someone who'd never raised a fist to him. Word had spread fast. By the next morning, every newspaper in the country was running the quote. By that afternoon, Dean's manager was fielding calls from reporters asking if there was a feud brewing. By that evening, Dean heard through the grapevine that Elvis had seen the interview, had watched it, had said nothing. That silence was worse than any response could have been. And now, 3 months later, Dean sat in a poker room, watching a door and waiting for whatever Elvis Presley had decided to do about it. The elevator chimed at 11:52. Dean's hand tightened on his bourbon glass. The liquid rippled. Frank stopped pretending to read his cards. Sammy stubbed out his cigarette. Peter Lawford looked like he wanted to run. The elevator doors opened. Elvis Presley walked out. Dean had seen Elvis on television, had seen him in magazines, had watched from a distance at industry events, but he'd never been this close. Never seen him like this. Elvis was wearing a black suit that probably cost more than Dean's first car. His hair was perfect, not a strand out of place. His jaw was set in a way that made Dean think of iron, of stone, of things that didn't bend. But it was Elvis's eyes that hit Dean like a fist to the solar plexus. They weren't angry, weren't burning with rage or vengeance or any of the things Dean had been preparing himself for. They were calm, almost gentle, and somehow that was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Behind Elvis stood 2 men, Dean recognized from photographs Red West and Sonny West, the Memphis Mafia. They weren't carrying weapons. Didn't need to. Elvis himself was weapon enough. Elvis walked straight toward the poker table. His shoes made no sound on the carpet. Each step was deliberate, measured, the walk of a man who'd already decided how this night would end and wasn't interested in negotiation. Dean stood up slowly. 50 years of performing had taught him that the first man to show fear loses the room, and Dean Martin had never lost a room. Never let anyone see him sweat. Never let the mask slip. He forced his famous smile, forced his voice into that casual, charming tone that had made him a legend. "Well, well," he said. The kid from Memphis finally decided to visit the adults' table. Frank chuckled, nervous, forced. Sammy didn't make a sound. Elvis stopped 3 feet from Dean, close enough to smell the bourbon Dean hadn't drunk, close enough to see the slight tremor in Dean's hand that the glass couldn't quite hide. "Mr. Martin," Elvis said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. Southern drawl thick as honey. "I heard what you said about me on television." Dean shrugged, kept the smile in place. "I call it like I see it, kid. Nothing personal. Nothing personal," Elvis repeated, like he was tasting something bitter. "You said I was destroying American music. You said I was a disgrace to the entertainment industry. You said, and I remember this exactly, you said I would die alone because nobody with real talent would ever respect me." The room went silent. Dean's smile flickered. Just for a moment. Just enough for Elvis to notice. "Look, kid," Dean started. "It was a joke. That's what I do. I make. Do you know what I did after I heard that interview, Mr. Martin?" Dean didn't answer. "I went to my mother's grave." The words landed like a physical blow. Dean felt something crack inside his chest, something he'd been keeping sealed for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Elvis took 1 step closer. "I sat there for 3 hours, and I talked to her about what you said. About dying alone, about being a disgrace, about being forgotten." His voice dropped lower, quieter. "My mother believed in me when nobody else did. She worked herself to death so I could have a chance, and she died before she could see me become what I became." Elvis's eyes never left Dean's face. "So when you talk about me dying alone, Mr. Martin, you're not just talking about me, you're talking about her. About everything she sacrificed, about the dream she had that I'm trying to honor every single day." Dean Martin had performed in front of presidents. He'd stared down mobsters in Chicago. He'd survived a career in an industry designed to chew people up and spit them out. But standing in front of Elvis Presley at that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Shame. "Elvis, I'm not finished." The words were quiet. Absolute. A door slamming shut. Elvis reached into his jacket pocket. Every man in the room tensed. Red and Sonny moved forward slightly. Frank's hand went to the edge of the table like he was ready to flip it. Sammy took a step back. Elvis pulled out a photograph. Old, creased, black and white. He held it up so Dean could see. 2 women standing in front of a small house, wearing plain dresses, smiling at the camera with that kind of smile that comes from people who've worked hard all their lives and are taking one moment to be happy. Dean stared at the photograph. His hand shook so hard the bourbon glass rattled. "Do you recognize her?" Elvis asked. Dean's voice came out broken, barely a whisper. "That's my mother, Angela Crosetti. Before she married your father." Dean couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at his mother's face in a photograph he'd never seen before. "They knew each other," Elvis said. "Did you know that?" Dean shook his head, couldn't speak. "Before either of us was born, our mothers worked together at a textile factory in Ohio. Your mother was there for 6 months before your family moved to Steubenville. My mother kept every photograph, every letter, every memory of the people who were kind to her during the hardest years of her life." Elvis turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded handwriting, Angela and Gladys Summer 1923, Sisters of the Soul. Your mother gave my mother a winter coat when she couldn't afford one. Elvis said, Did you know that? Gave her the coat off her own back because she saw a young woman shivering and decided to do something about it. Dean's bourbon glass slipped from his hand. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. Whiskey spread across the green felt in a dark stain. Nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody looked away from Dean's face. Remember this, because what was happening to Dean Martin in that moment wasn't just shock or surprise. It was the complete destruction of the story he'd been telling himself for 3 months. The story that said his cruelty was justified. That said Elvis deserved it. That said nothing he'd done really mattered. My mother told me about your mother, Elvis continued. She told me Angela was the kindest woman she ever met, that she never forgot her, that she prayed for her every single night until the day she died. He handed the photograph to Dean. Dean took it with trembling hands, stared at his mother's face, at the woman who'd raised him, who'd worked herself to exhaustion to give him a chance, who'd died before she could see him become Dean Martin, the star, the legend, the man who made America laugh. I didn't come here to fight you, Mr. Martin, Elvis said. I came here to give you this, because you should have it. Because your mother's kindness to my mother is worth more than any insult you could ever throw at me. Dean's eyes grew wet. His jaw tightened. 50 years of walls, carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, never allowed to crack, began to crumble. Elvis, his voice broke. I didn't know. I didn't know. I know you didn't. That's why I'm telling you now. Elvis turned to leave. He was at the elevator door when Dean's voice stopped him. Wait. Elvis turned. Dean Martin was still holding the photograph. Tears were running down his face. In front of Frank Sinatra, in front of Sammy Davis Jr., in front of Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop, in front of the Rat Pack, in front of everyone who had ever believed that Dean Martin was too cool to cry. I'm sorry, Dean said. The words came out raw, unpolished, real. For what I said, for all of it, I was wrong. Elvis nodded once. I forgive you. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and Dean Martin stood in that poker room, holding a photograph of 2 women who had loved each other like sisters, wondering how he had spent so many years being cruel to the son of a woman who had shown his mother kindness. Frank Sinatra was the first to speak. Dino, don't, Dean said. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looked at the photograph, at his mother's face. Just don't. He walked to the window, looked out at the Las Vegas Strip, stretching into the desert darkness. Neon lights blinking, cars moving, people gambling and drinking, and pretending they weren't afraid of dying alone. Dean pressed his forehead against the glass, cold, grounding. I have to fix this, he whispered. How? Sammy asked. Dean didn't know. Not yet. But he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. 3 days later, at 3:33 in the morning, Dean's private line rang in the darkness. He'd been awake, hadn't slept properly since that night in the poker room. The photograph sat on his nightstand. He'd been staring at it for hours. Dean picked up the phone. Hello? Mr. Martin, it's Elvis. Dean sat up in bed. Elvis, it's 3 in the morning. I know. I couldn't sleep. I've been thinking about what happened at the Sands. Look, I already apologized. I meant it. We're square. This isn't about the apology, Mr. Martin. This is about your son. Dean's blood went cold. What about my son? Dean Paul. He's 19 years old. He wants to be a singer. And from what I hear, he's got talent. How do you know about my son? I know a lot of things, Mr. Martin. I know he's been trying to get a record deal for 2 years. I know every label has turned him down because they don't want to be seen as giving favors to Dean Martin's kid. And I know you've been pulling strings behind the scenes trying to help him, and it's not working. Every word was true. Dean Paul had inherited his father's voice and his mother's determination, but the industry that had embraced Dean Martin in the 40s now saw his son as a liability, too connected, too privileged, too much baggage. "What's your point?" Dean asked. "My point is that I have a recording session booked at RCA next month. I have 2 songs that I think would be perfect for a duet, and I want Dean Paul to sing them with me." Dean almost dropped the phone. "You want to record with my son? I want to give him a chance, a real chance. Not because of who his father is, but because I've heard him sing and he deserves it." "Why?" Dean's voice cracked. "After everything I said about you, why would you do this?" Elvis was quiet. "Then because I know what it's like to have a father who wasn't there. I watched my mother work herself to death, trying to give me what he couldn't. Your son has a father who loves him, who fights for him. That's rare, Mr. Martin. That's precious." Dean's eyes filled with tears for the second time in 3 days. "Elvis, I don't know what to say. Say yes. Let your son come to Nashville. Let me help him the way your mother helped mine. Yes." Dean's voice was barely a whisper. "God, yes. Thank you. One condition. Anything. Stop making jokes about me on television. Not because they hurt my feelings. They don't. But because every time you do it, your son has to watch his father be cruel, and that boy worships you, Mr. Martin. He deserves better than to see that side of you." Dean closed his eyes. In all his years in show business, no one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever held up a mirror and forced him to look at what he had become. "You're right," Dean said. "I'll stop. Then we have a deal." "Elvis?" "Yes. Why are you really doing this?" "The truth." Another long pause. "Then because I know what it's like to have a father who wasn't there. My daddy tried his best, but he didn't know how to show up for me. Not really. And I watched what that did to my mother. Watched her try to be both parents at once. Watched her work herself into an early grave trying to give me what he couldn't." His voice grew thick. "Your son has a father who loves him, who fights for him, who would do anything to see him succeed. That's rare, Mr. Martin. That's precious. And I want to honor it." Dean Martin, the man who had built a career on being unflappable, broke down completely. He sobbed into the phone like a child. "Thank you," he managed. "Thank you. Get some sleep, Mr. Martin. We've got a lot of work to do." Elvis hung up, and Dean Martin sat in the darkness of his bedroom, holding a photograph of 2 women who'd been sisters of the soul, wondering how he had spent so many years hating the wrong person. The recording session happened September 15th, 1965. Dean Paul Martin and Elvis Presley recorded 2 songs at RCA Nashville. Neither was ever released, but those sessions launched Dean Paul's career, opened doors that had been sealed shut, and they began a friendship between Elvis and Dean that would last until death separated them. A friendship that nobody knew about. A friendship built on midnight phone calls and secret meetings. A friendship that would be tested by tragedy, addiction, and the crushing weight of fame. Listen to this carefully, because what happened over the next 12 years transformed both men in ways the public never saw. Dean Martin continued to perform, continued to drink, continued to play the role of the effortlessly cool entertainer who never let anything touch him, but in private, he was a different person. He called Elvis every Sunday night at exactly 10 o'clock Pacific time. They talked about everything. Music, family, the crushing loneliness that came with being worshipped by millions. The way fame could make you feel like the most isolated person on earth. Elvis called Dean Dino during these conversations. Dean called Elvis country boy. They laughed at jokes that weren't funny. They cried about losses that words couldn't capture. They became brothers, not by blood, but by choice. In 1973, Dean Paul Martin enlisted in the California Air National Guard. He wanted to be a fighter pilot. Wanted to prove that he was more than just a singer, more than just Dean Martin's son. Elvis flew to California for the graduation ceremony. He sat in the back row wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, hoping nobody would recognize him. Dean spotted him anyway. After the ceremony, the two men embraced in the parking lot. Dean was crying. "You came?" he said. "Of course I came. That's what brothers do." "I never had a brother," Dean admitted. "Neither did I," Elvis said. "Not until you." That night, they gathered at Dean's house in Beverly Hills. Elvis played piano. Dean sang. Dean Paul sat between them, listening to two legends create music that would never be recorded, never be released, never be heard by anyone outside that room. At 3 in the morning, Elvis said something Dean would never forget. "Dino, I need to tell you something." "What is it, country boy?" "I'm not going to make it much longer. The pills, the pressure. I'm drowning, and I don't know how to swim anymore." Dean grabbed Elvis by the shoulders. "Then let me help you. Let me." "You can't help me. Nobody can. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, and I will be gone soon, I can feel it. I need you to take care of my people, my family, my friends, the ones who'll be lost without me." "Elvis, don't talk like that. Promise me, Dino." Dean looked into Elvis's eyes, saw the exhaustion, the pain, the desperate hope of a man who knew his time was running out. "I promise," Dean said. Elvis hugged him, held on for a long time. "You're the only person I've ever told," he whispered. "The only person who knows how scared I am. I'm scared too, country boy. Every damn day. Then we're scared together. That's something, right? That's everything." 4 years later, Elvis Aaron Presley died in his bathroom at Graceland, August 16, 1977. He was 42 years old. Dean Martin got the call at 4:47 Pacific Time. He didn't speak for 3 hours, just sat in his chair, holding the phone, staring at nothing. His wife Jean found him there at 8. "Dean, honey, what happened?" "He's gone," Dean whispered. "Elvis is gone." "Oh, Dean, I'm so sorry." "He knew, Jean. He told me years ago. He knew he wasn't going to make it." Dean looked up at his wife with eyes that had aged 20 years in 3 hours. "And I didn't save him. I promised to take care of his people, but I couldn't save him." The funeral was held on August 18th at Graceland. 2,000 people gathered outside the mansion. Inside, a smaller group said goodbye to the man who had changed American music forever. Dean Martin sat in the third row. He hadn't slept in 2 days, hadn't eaten, had barely spoken. When the service ended, when the other mourners began to file out, Dean stayed. He walked to the casket, looked at the face of his brother, and he did something that no one expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. Old, creased, black and white. Angela and Gladys. Summer 1923. Sisters of the Soul. He placed it in the casket next to Elvis's hand. "Your mama and my mama," Dean whispered. "They're together now, country boy. And you're with them. And one day soon, I think, I'll be there too." He leaned down and kissed Elvis's forehead. "Thank you for teaching me how to be kind. Thank you for saving my son. Thank you for being my brother." Then Dean Martin, the man who never cried, the man who never showed emotion, the man who had built an empire on being cool, collapsed against the casket and wept. Priscilla Presley found him there 20 minutes later, still crying, still holding on to the edge of the casket like it was the only thing keeping him on earth. "He loved you," Priscilla said softly. "I know." Dean's voice was broken. "I loved him too. I just wish I had told him more." He knew, Dean. He always knew. Dean Martin never fully recovered from Elvis's death. He continued to perform, continued to drink, continued to play the role that America expected. But something was broken inside him, something that couldn't be fixed. In 1987, his son Dean Paul was killed in a plane crash, an F-4 Phantom jet during a training exercise. He was 35 years old. The boy Elvis had helped. The boy who'd sat between them, listening to music that night in Beverly Hills. The boy Dean had fought so hard to protect. Gone. Dean stopped performing after that. Stopped leaving his house. Stopped pretending that life was one big party where nothing could hurt you. He died on Christmas Day, 1995, 78 years old, alone in his Beverly Hills home. The doctors said it was respiratory failure, but the people who knew him, really knew him, said he died of a broken heart, a heart that had been breaking slowly since August 16, 1977. At Dean's funeral, they found something in his wallet. A photograph. Old, creased, black and white. Two women standing in front of a small house. On the back, in faded handwriting, Angela and Gladys. Summer 1923. Sisters of the soul. He had carried it with him every single day since Elvis's death. 18 years of holding on to that connection. 18 years of remembering the kindness that had bridged two families. The photograph was buried with him, just like he had buried one with Elvis. Two brothers, two mothers, two souls connected across generations by a simple act of grace. A coat given to a shivering woman on a cold Ohio morning in 1923. That's the real story of Dean Martin and Elvis Presley. Not the rivalry, not the jokes, not the public feud that sold newspapers and entertained audiences. The real story is about two men who learned that hatred is exhausting and kindness is eternal. The real story is about mothers who plant seeds they never see grow. The real story is about the courage it takes to apologize, to forgive, to reach across the divide, and find the humanity in someone you've decided to despise. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have done what Dean did? Would you have let Elvis teach you how to be kind? And if you want to hear what really happened the night Dean's son called him from Nashville after that first recording session with Elvis, tell me in the comments.